We now know that this is a man who had installed spyware on everybody's electronic communications devices, was tracking mum's car, had software on the family computer to see what files, keylogging type software, what files were being accessed, had installed CCTV throughout the house, covert, overt CCTV, was sleeping with a knife under his bed, had made disclosures to their marriage guidance counsellor about the sort of intrusive, violent thoughts he was having. He'd been involved in incidents publicly. He'd gone into a police station in another force area to say that he thinks that Claire and the man she was having an affair with would conspire to kill him. And he knew, because of this spyware, because of his ability to see what was on Claire's phone, from his perspective, she'd lied because they'd shared some intimate messages and communication that morning. And that, for him, gave him permission to do what he did next, which was to try and stab the 16-year-old girl. Claire, mum, stood to protect her, and he stabbed her first in the side with this knife and proceeded then to chase the 16-year-old girl around the house trying to kill her, whilst Claire was still not dead but hanging on for dear life to try and stop him.
Welcome to the Targeted Violence podcast. After focusing on mass casualty attacks in recent episodes, we're going to switch gears today and examine stalking, a form of targeted violence that's often underreported and notoriously difficult to address. I'm delighted to welcome Detective Sergeant David Thomason to the podcast, who leads the harm reduction unit within the Cheshire Police, to talk about stalking. In particular, the unique policing initiative that they're undertaking to addressing and preventing stalking. David, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. At last.
Yes, we finally got there. Now, can you tell us a bit about your background and what led you into this area of policing, particularly focusing on stalking and also the policing of harmful behaviour?
So I never joined the police expecting that, over 20 years later now, I'd be working in this field. I joined with ideas of being a dog handler and racing around with blue lights, and I have done a little bit of that in my career. But I early on in my career, I became a staff officer for a chief police officer at our force called Gary Shewan, and he was the first specific national stalking policing lead. So the Association of Chief Police Officers in England and Wales, as it was at the time, they have national thematic leads for different areas of policing, and Gary became the first stalking lead. Before then, it had always come under the umbrella of domestic abuse, and that still remains an issue now, that stalking is often regarded as a subset of domestic abuse. And whilst there is domestic abuse stalking, it's not always helpful to frame it in that context, as I'm sure we'll probably explore later on. But he took that portfolio, and I became his staff officer, and we had two main objectives at the time. One was to revise the national practice advice for the police service, and secondly, to introduce some kind of tool to help police officers better, more consistently identify what stalking is. And we worked with Professor Carl Roberts and Dr. Lorraine Sheridan, who you might know, I'm sure, on that. And I did that for a couple of years, but through that work, I met some key individuals, those being Tracy Morgan, whose experience of being stalked rather, and subsequent campaigning led to our primary piece of legislation in this country, the Protection from Harassment Act. as well as mothers of women whose who their daughters effectively had been killed by their stalkers. And you can imagine, having been failed by the police, by the criminal justice system, by everyone pretty much, how much it took them to trust the police and work with the police. But they were determined to, and they didn't want their daughters' deaths to be in vain. And I think it was the first time that a national police working group had actually included victims to be part of that working group in terms of strategy and policy. A massive step for them. So those mothers being Trisha Bernal and Carol Faruqi, whose daughters Clare Bernal and Rana Faruqi were both killed by their stalkers. And we became friends, and eventually we set up a charity called Protection Against Stalking. And we recognised that the law needed to be changed, and we campaigned for the law reform that took place in 2012, when the word stalking was finally actually mentioned in our legislation. Not how we said that legislation should look, and again, we'll probably talk about that later, but from that work with the charity, the law reform, I remained involved in the policing of stalking as an operational detective, but still working regionally, nationally, internationally, in fact, and becoming increasingly specialised until around 2000. Well, I know exactly when it was. In 2014, it got to the point where something different needed to be done, and that really was the catalyst for what has now become this multi-agency integrated stalking risk management service that is the harm reduction unit. So it's been a long evolution from being in that staff officer role and meeting those key individuals, and there are others along the way, because I made a promise to them that I'll do everything that I can to stop it, or try and stop it happening to somebody else, or that other people's daughters aren't going to be lost. So it was really that commitment that I made 18, 19 years ago, whatever it was. And here we are.
It sounds like it became or it has maybe even still become a very personal mission for you to really make sure that you are able to make a
Yeah,
difference.
you can't help but be touched by, I can stand in front of police officers or other professionals for hours talking about legislation, statistics, typologies, you name it. And some of it may be absorbed by the the people in that audience, but when you've got somebody next to you whose daughter or loved one has been stolen in such a brutal and often often avoidable circumstances, or somebody that has survived it who thinks that they're lucky. Tracy Morgan, she considers herself one of the lucky ones. This is somebody who was being stalked. I think it started around 1992, and there was no law, and yet here she is, decades later, still suffering, still battling the system to try and keep herself safe. You can't, and Tracy, for example, I've heard Tracy speak publicly so many times, but every time I hear her, something else strikes me, and something else sort of motivates you to want to keep doing better and keep doing more. Because I think with stalking, unlike other types of crime, and I'm not saying other types of crime aren't traumatic, but often the impact is relatively acute. Tracy will talk, she'll say, like, she's got complex post-traumatic stress, and she says the P for her and other stalking victims isn't post. It's not like witnessing a big a bomb going off, and yes, tragic, awful, awful, but it happened. But if you're being stalked, every message, every contact, every noise is like being psychologically assaulted every single time. So it's not post, it's persistent. And how do you help and treat, from a medical sense, somebody who is still being routinely, persistently traumatized? She describes it, Tracy, like she uses the term mental rape, or like walking along a cliff edge and not knowing whether today is the day that you're going to be pushed off. And these kind of things resonated with me, and um, that they are inspirational. The fact that people like that have survived or have lost loved ones because of police failings, because of the profession that I joined to try and avoid. I don't know how. I'm very glad that they do it. We should all be very, very grateful that these people can and do what they're doing. I don't know how they do it, how they get the strength, but in those circumstances, I think often it's part of their, it's how they deal with that grief, with the loss, that they don't want their daughters' lives and what's happened to them, to have been in vain. So, yeah, you almost feel compelled, and the more we do, the more they sort of talk about it. It's impossible to walk away from it. Not that I want to, but yeah. So personal, very much so. But I try not to. I do try and adopt an evidence-led approach to what we're doing as well.
It's really interesting in the family violence space and also the stalking space, because the victims or victim advocates have really played huge roles, haven't they? I think regardless of what country you're in, they've all played really significant roles in often shaping legislation, informing responses, and of course that then impacts what gets rolled out at a police level. So I think we can't understate, can we, how important victim advocates are in these spaces.
No, and you know what? Victims, certainly stalking victims, they're not actually asking for much. They all they if what I've learned over the years, and when I tell this to people, it's like there's some kind of revelation, and you think, well, why should this be? Why should this strike you as a new thing? But it matters often more how victims are treated than any potential outcome, any conviction or 4 weeks in prison or arbitrary sanction, whatever that. I'm not saying that's not necessary, but if somebody isn't treated correctly, all that becomes less, if not insignificant. So victims, they want their experience to be validated. They want to be taken seriously, and they just all want it to stop. How we achieve that is the sort of $1 million question. And that comes back to the fact that we shouldn't be treating stalkers, especially, or any criminals, but stalkers, as a homogenous group. They are, we could bring a stalker in here now. You've met one stalker. Even if we bring a rejected stalker in, you've met one rejected stalker. And whilst there might be commonality within that type of stalker as a subset, as a group, they've all been on their own journey. They've all had the journey which has led them to that point where this maladaptive, or in the broadest sense of the term, problem behaviour has or is meeting their needs. And yes, there may be similarities, but unless we understand what drives those individuals, what motivates them, what stops them as well, this is the question that is often more helpful to ask, not why are they stalking, or why do stalkers stalk, which people are naturally curious about, But if you ask yourself the question, why do most people not stalk? Most people that have been rejected, most people that have been done over, or feel aggrieved for whatever reason, or people with conditions, just because somebody has insert condition doesn't cause them to stalk. And we can say that with absolute certainty, because if all people with schizophrenia, if we said that all people that stalk because of schizophrenia, well, that we know that's not right, because most people with schizophrenia or a mental health, an actual disorder, don't stalk. So it's not causal. The relevant question is, what is it about that person's condition or that person's circumstances that has led them to stalk? And that's where the role of certainly psychology is significant. I'm not a psychologist. That's not to say that my work isn't psychologically informed, and equally the health care staff in our team. That's just because they're healthcare staff. That's not to say that they don't have knowledge and understanding of the legislation and the criminal aspect of this. But fundamentally, unless we see this as a public health issue rather than primarily a legal problem, we're always going to be on the back foot. And I think that's something that advocates, I can't emphasize enough how vital their role is, certainly in a team like ours. But in terms of campaigning, it's it's more than just giving the victim a voice. It's helping them navigate a system that often makes them feel that they're the ones that are on trial, that they've done something wrong. And victims are often asking themselves the same question: have I done something? Why me? And to have an advocate say, we might never know. And it's okay to say that. It's okay. Some stalking is very clearly this type of stalking, and we know why they're doing it. But there are other types of stalking where we're just really not 100% sure. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that risks disappear or evaporate, but to have somebody validate that, somebody that knows what they're talking about, that is part of a specialist team, it's huge. And there are victims that our advocates work with that are absolutely clear that I would not be here if it weren't for these advocates on my side, fighting my corner. So yeah, absolute total respect to anybody watching or listening, working in that field. It's a very, very difficult and specialist role.
Gosh, there's a lot there in what you just said. I
Yeah.
mean, one of the first things is spot on, as you're saying. When victims want to feel understood, they want to feel acknowledged, and then ultimately they're asking for some sort of response that will help them feel protected, and adding to that as well with the various different types of stalkers, as you say, that's not they're not all cut from the same rug, and they are all very different. And I also like, as you just mentioned, around sometimes that negative question around why are more people not stalking? Why everyday people not just stalking their partners when they have a breakup. So sometimes that's a really good way to reframe it and think about things as well. Now, you police in Cheshire, if I'm pronouncing that right, and how big a district is that over there?
Geographically, it's quite a large area. It's a largely rural force. So we're in the northwest of England, situated between Liverpool and Manchester. We've got 7 other forces, Liverpool and Manchester being two of them either side of us. So 2 big metropolitan cities with big populations. But then you've got Cheshire, relatively rural. Our population is about 1 million. There are a couple of big towns, one city, but largely rural. So yeah, it's quite a large area geographically. We're sort of comparatively a medium-sized police force amongst the I think 43 in England and Wales. So yeah, it's about that kind of area.
So when you got your unit off the ground, I think it was initially the anti-stalking unit, were there challenges of getting that off the ground? I'm wondering whether some of it is that you potentially a smaller district that allowed something like that to get off the ground. But I also, knowing policing as well, it sometimes can be very hard to create change as well.
Yeah, it is. And the significant thing about what we did is that it's practitioner led. The whole thing's practitioner led, practitioner developed, created. Our idea, it wasn't, here's a problem, or as is often the case, something's gone terribly wrong, or we've messed up, and a boss under pressure to do something tries to come up with some kind of, so that was absolutely not what happened. This was,
Yep.
it sort of, as I described it, evolved from my involvement, and I'd always had this idea about some kind of clinic or some kind of joint approach, through the work that had been leading up to this. There are things like so the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre in which deals with fixated threat against the royal family and VIP, members of parliament. That the idea of police working with mental health wasn't novel, but this integrated approach was and routine and beyond that very specialist sort of public figure scope is something that had always been at the back of my mind. But it was one particular case that led me, that was really the catalyst, if you like, the spark to, no, I need to do something now. And that case led me to, because I was working in an area in the north of our force, our county, two big towns or boroughs, Halton and Warrington, where I was working at the time. And that led me to reach out to my boss and say, look, I've got this idea for, when we called it a clinic at the time. And I reached out to our the psychologist who's still with us now, more than 10 years later, and said, what do you think? And we both went to our respective senior leaders and said, look, we've got this idea to have a monthly clinic where we'd discuss a stalking case. We'd come up with a psychological and risk formulation. We'd give some really clear tactical and investigative advice to the investigating officer, and hopefully set it on a path towards a better outcome. And that's essentially how it started, a monthly meeting in addition to our day jobs. There was no money, it was all run on goodwill and fresh air and that permission from senior leaders. And it was in a relatively small area. And when people now ask us, where do we start? They come and see this slick, big or relatively big operation, but they don't see. I mean, I had hair when we started. This is the consequence of this filling out information sharing agreements and stuff. But uh, it they don't see that pain that we've been through. And my advice is to all of them: start small. Develop your own pathways clearly according to what your local set up and your local needs are. Commissioning is different and priorities are different and resources. So start small, build up the data, build up the evidence. And that's exactly, I'm not saying that's how you must do it, but that was our experience. And it enabled us to sort of fine tune and continually refine this quite neat pathway that we've developed now. So yeah, that's so starting small definitely helped. And then after about 16 months of doing that and it becoming increasingly in demand and more people seeing the benefit and reaching out, officers saying, help me, I need, we presented our findings because we collected loads and loads of data, and it looked really good. And we did a presentation to our respective senior leaders and said, look, you either support this or we're going to have to knock it on the head because it's not sustainable. We were doing silly hours per week. And it was at that point, someone in the room said, have you heard of the Police Transformation Fund? It's a government fund for sort of innovation. And it closes in 3 days. And in those 3 days between ourselves, the Susie Lamplugh Trust, who are the national sort of stalking charity here, the Met Police and Hampshire Police, I say cobbled, we very quickly put together a bid for what became known as MASIP, the Multi-Agency Stalking Interventions Programme, which was funded for 2 years. But what it did for us, it enabled us to do full time what we'd been doing in our spare time, and to really get some real good quality data and have it evaluated by the Jill Dando Institute at UCL. So Professor Lisa Thompson, who I think is over in your neck of the woods now anyway, sort of world expert in evidence-led policing. It was a real boon for us to have that. And yeah, we did that for 2 years, and that ended in around COVID time, March 2020. And out of that evolved the harm reduction unit. So we'd only been operating in those 2 small towns. And for that to be sustained longer term, you couldn't have a police and crime commissioner fund something that only taxpayers only in a certain part of the force would benefit from. So we had to expand, go force wide, bring in another health trust. And we also recognised that beyond stalking, lots of other problem behaviour would be brought to our door that people just didn't really know what to do with. Fire setting, querulent individuals, some of the more deviant, aberrant sort of sexual violence that wasn't overtly sexual, but it didn't neatly fit into structures that were in place already. So we found that our role slightly diversified, and we became known as the harm reduction unit. But I suppose more recently, it's very clear that our primary role is around tackling stalking. So whilst the name is still harm reduction unit, we are essentially the anti-stalking unit still.
And you mentioned earlier that at the time when the unit was commencing, there was a case that became quite pivotal. Is that fair to say,
It
in
absolutely
getting
was,
some
yeah.
momentum?
Yeah, it's the worst thing I've ever personally had to deal with in policing. And me and a colleague, we were the detective cover one weekend. It was a Sunday in November 2014, and my colleague, detective, made the grave mistake, which probably should be a criminal offence, of using the Q word. Hasn't it been Q this weekend? Quiet. And I kid you not, it was within minutes we were made aware of this incident. And just to set the context, this is a relatively small village in a leafy, rural, sort of, albeit in a suburb in the town where we were. Big detached house, mum, dad, 3 children, aged 16-year-old daughter, a 9-year-old son, and a 7-year-old son. He worked full time at a big company in Chester, not too far away, in IT. Mum didn't work, but was very involved in the community and around the children's schooling, and from the outside looked like the sort of perfect nuclear family, but things weren't happy families. They were in the process of getting going through, they were going to be divorced. Mum had been having an affair, which was known about. It wasn't like a secret, or it wasn't suddenly discovered. And just to add some context, before this had happened, they'd been for their sort of final family holiday. I think they'd been to Turkey, and when they came back, one of the children told me that dad had said to them, "When we get back, I'm going to be good, dad. I'm going to be good, dad, from now on." And that for me was very sort of instructive. That sort of comment. The family, mum and the 3 children, had been up to Scotland 3 weeks prior to this date, in November, because that's where half the family is from, and they came back to the house and they were just finalising arrangements. When people go through a divorce, when they're dividing assets and who's going to, all that sort of stuff. And this Sunday morning, the 7-year-old, he'd been out to his kids' football team and come back. So he's in his football kit and socks. 9-year-old, he'd gone out just playing football on the park with his friends. So in this house, in the kitchen, is dad, mum, 16-year-old girl, and 7-year-old boy. Dad is at the kitchen counter, the worktop, with a malt loaf, like a cake, and cutting it using, like when you have a block of knives, the biggest, the chef's knife, using that to cut it and spread butter on it, and says to the 16-year-old girl something akin to, "What about your mum having that affair then?" "Well, it's because of you, the way you are, Dad, that, she had." And Mum, Claire, says, "Well, why are you bringing that up now? Why mention that now? It's over. Why you mention it? Why mention that?" We now know that this is a man who had installed spyware on everybody's electronic communications devices, was tracking Mum's car, had software on the family computer to see what files, keylogging type software, what files were being accessed, had installed CCTV throughout the house, covert, overt CCTV, was sleeping with a knife under his bed, had made disclosures to their marriage guidance counsellor about the sort of intrusive, violent thoughts he was having. He'd been involved in incidents publicly. He'd gone into a police station in another force area to say that he thinks that Claire and the man she was having an affair with would conspire to kill him. And he knew, because of this spyware, because of his ability to see what was on Claire's phone, from his perspective, she'd lied because they'd shared some intimate messages and communication that morning. And that, for him, gave him permission to do what he did next, which was to try and stab the 16-year-old girl. Claire, mum, stood to protect her, and he stabbed her first in the side with this knife, and proceeded then to chase the 16-year-old girl around the house, trying to kill her, whilst Claire was still not dead, but hanging on for dear life to try and stop him. The emergency number was dialed, 999 here, to contact the police. And the 16-year-old girl went to the bathroom, which is a common thing in these situations. People will often go to the bathroom because it's usually the only internal door with a lock, on. And she tried to hold the door closed, and he was hacking at the door with the knife, and he actually ended up cutting one of the fingers off in the process. Bearing in mind the 7-year-old's watching this, he then set about killing Claire using 2 knives repeatedly, and I think she sustained 51 injuries in total, many of them post-mortem, going straight through her, in fact. Absolutely horrific. He then picked up the 7-year-old and carried him to some woods nearby. Didn't harm intentionally or kill the 7-year-old, and brought him back. And at that point, the 16-year-old girl fled to the neighbours, which is when the alarm was raised and when we became aware of this incident, and went straight up there. And all this I mentioned was, they phoned 999 for was captured. And whilst he's killing, he's saying, "Look what you made me do. Look what you've made me do." And the reason I tell people, certainly police officers, about this isn't for any sort of grotesque interest, or because it is horrific. The worst thing you can ever imagine. And me having to tell the 9-year-old when he comes back what's happened. he doesn't know any of this, what's happened while he's been away, is to never, ever make the mistake when people are writing risk assessments or summarizing jobs and incidents that they've been to use this concept of hasn't been violent previously, therefore risk of violence is low. That is 100% not the case. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, Nathan, but people don't recognize. And how many times do we hear it? He hasn't been violent before. He was never, you hear it when there's a murder or a serious incident. People on the news, the neighbours, well, he's a quiet person, kept himself to himself. Well, of course, he's not going to run around with a knife or a gun and that's not what this looks like. This is a man that wouldn't look dissimilar to you or I. No big forensic antecedent of violence, no antisocial lifestyle, no problematic substance misuse. All these clear sort of risk status indicators weren't there. But risk state at that point went through the roof and gave him that permission to use violence as a legitimate means to protect himself from the psychological injury that he's experienced from that rejection. I know I'm not getting back with you, but I'm going to punish you for what you've done and continue to do to me. Very, very selfish. To effectively execute somebody, to make that problem from his perspective go away. And this is why I tell police officers certainly about it, that just because somebody doesn't have all this police history, doesn't have all this contact, doesn't mean that they can't be violent under the right conditions. Everybody is capable of catastrophic violence under the right conditions. So that demonstrated to me that case specifically, and dealing with those children and everything that happened then, that what was in place was not sophisticated enough to deal with the risks in stalking specifically. We have risk assessments, we have multi-agency meetings, but they often have this very sort of reductionist, often pathologizing approach to conceptualize risk. If we get the perpetrator stable housing, if we get them a job, if we get them off drugs, if we put them on a course, if we put the victim on a course to educate them out of being abused, all this, if you walk around with a hammer long enough, everything looks like a nail, to try and I get it. I understand but that's not, it doesn't answer the who, what, why, where, when stuff. It doesn't scenario plan. It doesn't use that contemporary evidence about objectively what's likely to happen and what do we need to do to stop it. So that question that I flipped at the start about why do most people not stalk, we know that also a lot of stalkers desist or stop without any intervention. Or we see these big periods of desistance. Now that might be because they've sort of gone more covert or, more secretive. But for us, it's a really interesting question. Well, why is it stopped now? What switched that risk off? Why is their need being met? And what is it? So it might be that they've entered a new relationship, and sorry for the new victim that this is going to happen to, but it raises, are there other things in that person's life? If you see stalking as a dark occupation, perhaps, which is why we have an occupational therapist working with us. So yeah, it answers a lot. It exposed all these gaps and in this, what is evident across policing, certainly, and health, I have to say, that risk as a general concept is pretty poorly understood, which is staggering considering that's pretty much all we're doing, making risk-based decisions all day.
Gosh, yeah. Again, you've said so much there. Horrifying case, and as you said, yeah, don't be reassured by an absence of previous criminality, an absence of violence, an absence of substance use. they are not necessarily going to provide
No,
anything from a
but
risk perspective.
conversely, if somebody does have that risk profile, previous behaviours, a good, predictor of future behaviour,
Yeah.
but it doesn't work the other way, that because it's not there, doesn't give you that confidence that it can't or won't happen in the same way.
No, and
So,
I can think of so many cases where those factors haven't been there, and they've been largely pro-social people, and relationships have ended, and they've gone on to kill their partner. And when you look at them, from a risk assessment perspective, they would always come back low because they don't have that in their history. I do think, as you're saying, around the challenges with risk, there has been a lot that's developed in the threat assessment space. And I think when we talk about in threat language, then we can get a bit more of an accurate read. I always think about intent and capability. So looking at where are they at right now at this point in time. Another way would be, how dialed up are the dials? How intense are things for this individual, and what's their capacity to, reason or work their way through it? And if the dials are dialed up, yeah, again, it's talking about right now in this moment. Then clearly there needs to be a need for
and
prevention
that's
if
that's
something's there.
essentially, whatever tool, whatever model, checklist, however it is, whatever framework you use to inform that assessment, including, experience and the subtle stuff that doesn't always appear in a checklist or a risk management model. Essentially, what we're doing is scenario planning. What's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? What's the likely scenario? And under what circumstances will that profile change? Is it the loss of employment? Is it this? What signs do we need to look out for as professionals? And certainly when we work with, well, not me personally, but we work from a therapeutic perspective with the critical few stalkers where it's actually viable to do that. Very often these are people that they don't accept, many of them, that they're a stalker. Nobody likes that label, but they do recognize, I keep getting arrested. I can't see my children. I've lost my job. I've lost my house. I'm struggling and finding it stressful. And it's not about poor stalker. The last thing we want is destabilized, disinhibited people at the end of their tether. So we look at the impact on the stalker ultimately to protect the victim, and that the conversation with them individually is often, so what signs do we need to look out for? What does deterioration look for? What does stress look like for you? Is there a code word that you can say when that's happening, that we need to be, whatever it is for them as an individual? And that's the key thing, that this isn't a behavior change program. It's not curing stalking. It's not this medical sort of approach. It's part of the broader psychosocial, legal, all of it coming together, and that work with some of the stalkers to get them to a point where they hopefully can. It's creating that opportunity for them to regulate that risk themselves. Ideally, it's not about deliberately torturing them with how bad they've been, and we know what's happened. We can't escape that, and it's probably unproductive and risky as well, because you're opening a can of worms, as therapeutically with some of these people. So it has to be done very carefully. But the people that we do work with in that way are the ones that are saying, I know I need help, but I don't know what that is. And we call them the critical few because they are the critical few. A lot of these people, certainly like those that have been in previous intimate relationships in that sort of domestic abuse context, they have this sort of hyperactivating attachment style, and they might be serial domestic abuse perpetrators, probably in need of long-term, deep, schema-based therapies. That's not what we're set up to address, and certainly not going to fix that in many cases in the short term. But when cases or individuals are crying out, they're at that point where it's ready for that to start, then why, I say this all the time, why wouldn't we? Why the public, often victims, look, I know jail is one thing, but that it doesn't stop for the victim then. The perpetrator's sentence, their license conditions, or whatever, at some point it will end for them. But for stalking victims, they've stolen this permanently. It's always there at the back of the mind. How do I trust people? How do I go into a new relationship? What if it happens again? And it's awful, absolutely awful, and all the more reason why an approach like this is so necessary.
So we've touched on quite a few things there again, but we've mentioned obviously risk assessment, which we might come back to shortly. But I'd be really curious to just unpack what the harm reduction unit looks like and how the process works. So how referrals come in, how you triage those, and then how you work out what type of response or prevention approach that you need to apply in a given case.
So we describe ourselves as a risk management service, a stalking risk management service. And what that looks like is you've got police officers, so 2 detective sergeants, me being one of them. We have a team of investigating police officers, so primarily concerned with the most serious and complex stalking investigations. And then we have police officers who are there as sort of experts in their own right, single points of contact for 3 broad geographical areas in our police force area, who are there to provide risk assessment, tactical and investigative advice, support with applications for things like stalking protection, so that very practical but specialist support to add value. And that's the question, our unit, in terms of what we get involved with and to what extent, is determined by answering what value are we going to add at any particular point. We've then got 3 healthcare professionals, a lead consultant forensic psychologist, a forensic practitioner, so a senior mental health nurse from that psychiatric perspective, and a specialist, advanced specialist occupational therapist, as I mentioned earlier. We've then got probation officers around, that are aligned with the service, managing these people on probation, experts in risk assessment themselves. And we have 2 specialist victims advocates who are integrated with the team but work independently, which is a really important component. And then finally, we've got our business support officer, who I sometimes describe as the glue, not very attractively, but to describe, she's absolutely more than that, but pulls this whole data pathway together, amongst many other things that she does. So cases primarily come in, most of our work on a daily basis. We, me and the other sergeants, scan and triage everything that has been codified as stalking. So everything that's been recorded as a stalking crime. And we record on average 10 a day. We also scan live incidents, anything containing the word stalking or stalk or stalked. And we go through a screening process to determine what, if any, value are we going to add. Primarily, is this a case we should take for investigative primacy? And if not, what are we going to do? Is it a case that needs that hands-on, very bespoke, tactical investigative advice to walk another investigating officer, sort of hold the hand through that process? What do you need to do, officer, to get this case where it needs to be? Is it stalking? Which offence? All that sort of stuff. Or is it's obviously stalking. It's relatively non-complex in terms of the investigation. And here's some general advice. So everything gets something, according to what our screening process determines. There are various different things we look at for that. We also get officers reaching out directly to us. An example, it might be, the burglary team. Look, we've had a burglary allocated to us, a domestic burglary. It is, but it's underwear that's been stolen, and it's the third time it's happened in 2 months. And so, this isn't keys being stolen to the Jaguar or the Range Rover. This is there's something not right here. So, cases like that are flagged up to us. Officers reach out. Probation officers will bring cases to us that whether or not they've been convicted with stalking the offender in the community or in prison, wherever they are at that point in time, but the nature of their offending is one of a stalking course of conduct. And then we also get health professionals in medium, low, high, sometimes secure inpatients, or people that are already open to secondary mental health services will recognise that sort of the nature of their patient or their client, and they'll also reach out to either flag cases or seek some consultative support. So that's how casework comes into us. Everything is screened to determine what does that case need from us. Is it the full investigation, advocacy, whole package? Is it some consultation guidance, or is it you're on the right track? Here's some general stuff. So and then we have a very elaborate pathway in terms of the life of those cases as they travel through, moving often from primarily a legal pathway, then going into a more purely risk management pathway where, if somebody is convicted, we don't wait for them to come out of prison. We'll go, and our health colleagues might go and visit them in prison. Often these people haven't even been asked. They've been convicted with stalking, but nobody's asked them, how much time do you spend thinking about the victim? That these sorts of we don't know often about their early childhood. We don't know about there are lots of gaps in their profile that we need to understand. So, it's a very comprehensive package of risk management. And obviously, sometimes our work is informed by things like the stalking risk profile and the SAM. Our health colleagues use all various other structured professional judgment tools. We've developed some of our own that, to help us understand where people are at in terms of therapeutic sort of viability of therapeutic readiness, that sort of stuff. So, that's a succinct as I can be way to describe what we're doing. But it's an ongoing, all day process of screening, triaging, assessing, investigating, risk managing. We're applying for stalking protection orders, which we've got here. Whatever we can do to try and get those cases where they need to be is.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds fantastic. So you were able to essentially to float across or float over cases, and when needed, become very, I guess, comprehensively involved. But just from what you're saying, it sounds as though part of it is simply whether it's in an advisory capacity, whether it's linking people into various services, whether it's completing assessments, then it might even be the active investigation phase as well.
Exactly. Yeah. If somebody's in custody, like this morning, if somebody's in custody in the cells, they've been arrested for stalking. An investigating officer has taken a decent witness statement, covers the points to prove for stalking. They know what the lines of inquiry are. They're clear. What value are we going to add by retelling them that it's stalk? It's those cases where a victim hasn't even used the word stalking. They haven't even conceptualized it that way. They'll contact and list off behaviours and things that are happening. And, it doesn't seem that serious. And, the person's got, again, insert condition, autism, personality, whatever it might be. So it's not that. They're the cases where we're like, hang on a second. Let's not pathologize this just because that condition's there, just because you don't think it's that serious, officer. We can see risk very quickly because we become more and more accustomed to this sort of approach. And that comes with experience, with knowledge, and as I say, it's not perfect, but we're probably more likely to add value in those cases that are about to, the way we think about it, all stalkers are on this trajectory. And up here, this is the start, and up here's the homicide. Now, most cases, the vast majority won't ever get there. Most of them won't even be violent. And that trajectory, that course of conduct can be days, weeks, it can be years. We've had a case that's gone on for 60 years. So some
Wow.
stalkers, decades, some weeks, days, whatever. And what makes them get off that path will be different according to who and what they are. Now we have to work out relatively quickly, are they up here or are they down here? And that's not to say victims should be grateful that it's in the early stages and it's not at the point where, somebody's ready, prepared to kill. Because that isn't the experience of most stalking victims, that cumulative impact over time. When victims are contacting us, it's more often than not at crisis point, because I can no longer manage this myself. I've tried everything. I've changed my routines. I've put security measures in. I've changed my phone numbers. I've blocked them. I've tried to be nice to them. Nothing. And they're calling us. They're not phoning us at the point when hardly anything's happening, when it's down here. The dam's already burst. So the onus is on us to work out quickly. Like you said, where's this person at right now? What are the red flags? Last resort thinking, homicidal, suicidal ideation, all that sort of stuff. We've identified people in the community that are psychotic, that wouldn't otherwise ever come near secondary mental health services, because these people are holding down jobs, paying the mortgages, all this sort of stuff. And you speak to them in custody. Do you know where you are? Do you know what time it is? Good eye contact, all thought, speech patterns, all that, fine. Ask them about MI5. Yes, they planted a thing that's growing in my. When they're sort of mono-delusional, or they believe that they're in a relationship, these people would look out of place in acute forensic mental health inpatient settings because they don't fit, but very often totally
Mm.
deluded. And it causes us issues when, if that person has some degree of insight, or if and when that happens, or the futility of their pursuit. So there's this myth as well that mentally ill or stalkers are the dangerous ones. Well, actually, it's often a protective factor, because they ascribe unique qualities to or they believe they're in a relationship. When that hope's there, and that it's less in terms of the risk of violence, still terrifying for the victim, but comparatively to a rejected stalker who's trying to punish their victim, the risk is, we want to keep people alive first and foremost. So, yeah, that screening for red flag thing is red flags is a key component of what we're doing first and foremost, to try and prioritize and organize our, amongst the whole spectrum of all unwanted repeated behavior, which is a very broad category of
Yeah.
offending. We're trying to identify those that are at that critical point.
And you mentioned before stalking protection orders. Are you able to talk us through those? And do you have a role in policing those?
Yeah, so in the grand scheme of things, relatively new. They came in January 2020. It's a civil order, so only the police can apply for this. We have to go to a magistrate and say, well, interestingly, we don't actually have to have the criminal offence of stalking. The law only requires that there's been behaviours associated with stalking, excuse me, which is a subtle but significant point. The idea with them is that it puts in place a robust legal framework when risk isn't being managed effectively, or to try and intervene as early as possible to put something in place to protect the victim and manage the stalker. Not only can we put prohibitions in, so you must not contact, communicate, attend, whatever it is, we can also put requirements on the respondent, stalker, if you like. you must be electronically monitored, with a GPS angle tag. You must provide your phone and PIN numbers to the police on request so that we can inspect your devices. You must not change your name. You must not move address without informing us. So we can put a lot of robust, and it's that they also have to register with police within 3 days of changing their name or address, or within getting one of these orders, so that we can track them and monitor them. Very, very tactically useful in terms of the management of risk. And we are one of the only few forces that is able to put the tracking tags on them. And the victim has a device as well. So if they come in close proximity, or if they enter exclusion zones, it creates an emergency incident in the police control room. Brilliant. And you can imagine, for victims whose worlds have been closed down, to have an order
Mm.
like this in place, whilst it's not perfect, it certainly helps knowing that their stalker is being monitored. And in terms of policing, so yeah, we coordinate and gatekeep all stalking protection order applications. We coordinate the management of them in the community, which is delivered by local policing, because we think that the management of stalkers in the community is a community policing problem. The community don't want the idea that these people are walking around free from police intervention,
Mm.
and rightly so. So yeah, they are. We do want them looking over their shoulder. Excuse me, the suspects. We want them to know that they're being policed, that we're watching them, that we're holding them to account, that we're checking their phones. So locally, police officers are supported by us in delivering that.
Is that in any way similar to child sex offender orders, where you get people that come out of custody and they may be electronically monitored and tracked in the community? Essentially, they're on the child sex offender register. Is it similar to that?
Uh, Similar. I mean, they're all, the register that they're on is the police national computer, because everybody that has a stalking protection order, it's shown on the police national computer. So if a stalker in Cheshire um, had a stalking protection order and went down to London for the day and was stop checked by the police for whatever reason, the police in London would know that this person has a stalking protection order through the police national computer. So they're all known and flagged. And if they move areas, there is a transfer process as well. So in a way, yes, it's similar. Where it varies is that there are dedicated teams of, they're called different things, sex offender liaison officers or management of sexual or violent offenders, where they have very sort of specific interventions with sex offenders who are more often than not indiscriminate. I suppose this is one of the key differences, where, a paedophile might be attracted to all children of a certain age, whereas sexually motivated stalkers or predatory stalkers, it's not about all women. It's about this particular, it's not about all Tracies. It's this Tracy or this, see what I'm saying? So, in terms of management, you can see why it's slightly different between management of child sex offenders and where they present a risk to lots and
Yep.
lots of people, whereas a
Yeah.
stalker is very much about, more often than not, about one individual or one particular cause. Thinking about resentful stalkers. So yeah,
Yeah.
similar, but different.
And what about the work with victims that your unit does? So you're obviously being very proactive and working and strategizing and safety planning with victims on cases to make sure that they're adequately supported.
Yeah, and we've got a significant caseload where we're providing, or our specialist victims advocates are providing that, as you say, practical support, safety planning, and that more conventional advocacy through the criminal justice process. For most people, this is the one and only time they will have contact with the criminal justice system. How do courts work? All the jargon, the legal process. Why are things happening? Why who's my lawyer? Well, you don't have a lawyer. It's the Crown, similar to the legal system there. It's these things are so sort of routine for us, but completely alien to most people and terrifying. The prospect of possibly having to stand in court and in the same room or in the presence, or knowing that your stalker, depending what special measures are put in place to protect them, but knowing that your stalker is going to be listening to what you're saying, and it is absolutely terrifying. And having an advocate there by your side, contactable, and in the case of our advocates, they're not a separate commissioned charity or service. They can access police systems. They can see when somebody's bail date has changed. They know who the investigating officer is, when they're on leave, when they can contact them directly. It makes a huge difference in being able to quench that thirst that many stalking victims have for knowledge. They want to know what their stalker's doing, where they're up to, even if the update is there is no update. Like I say, when you're sort of in the headlights, it's terrifying. So they undoubtedly, the success that we have around charges and convictions is in no small part thanks to the role of our specialist advocates, able to do that for victims and be in it for the long haul. And it can be a long haul, from the point of reporting to a trial at court and then beyond. But there comes a point when our advocates, they're not there to provide therapy. So many victims feel the intervention is therapeutic, in terms of having, but they're not there to counsel from a sort of a therapeutic intervention sense. And that is a gap that we recognise, because if you're convicted of stalking or any crime and you end up, on probation in the community, you have a statutory service with an offender manager to help you rebuild your life, apply for housing, benefits, on all sorts of courses, you name it. But if you're the victim of a crime, if you're a victim of stalking, it's usually left to charities, or you join the queue with everybody else for talking therapies, or there's no statutory victim rehabilitation, help you rebuild your life. So I'd like to think that our advocates go some way to help with that, but compared to the interventions that are available for perpetrators beyond, in the excuse me, in the community, it's very different and inconsistent across the country. It is relatively unique. Sometimes services are only commissioned from a domestic abuse perspective, which absolutely vital, but this isn't always domestic abuse. Around 40% to half of all stalking victims haven't been in a relationship with their abuser, their stalker. So if you are a domestic abuse victim, you have things like MARAC, the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, locally commissioned IDVA services. Lots of organisations have a domestic abuse policy. There are charities and all this. But if you've been stalked by somebody and you've not been in a relationship with them, there is nothing. There's no refuges. There's no other than us. We are it. And if you're in one of the most forces that don't have something like what I'm describing here, it seems very, very unjust. Hopefully that is starting to change, but it's inconsistent and it's not fair either.
One of the big issues is often the advice that victims are given, and I know you're talking on the advocacy role, particularly around navigating the whole criminal justice system, but when there's active stalking going on and there isn't some sort of imminent threat or persistence around, what strategies are effective with victims. And in the literature, certainly that Spitzberg and Kupak they've written about, the moving away, moving inwards, moving outwards, moving with or also moving against. Have you found that those strategies are effective, or that anything generally is more effective or more problematic for victims when they're trying to adapt those or apply them?
Yeah, it helps knowing and them knowing, like they're trained in the stalking risk profile, for example, and they are able to help victims understand why they might have inconsistent attitudes, why they might have inconsistent behavior, by which I mean inconsistent with, if you've got a victim that is saying, I have to speak to my stalker because, yes, I let him FaceTime our child every night because, yes, he says he wants to speak to the children, but the communication is, where have you been? Who have you been seeing? What have you done today? But if that's all I have to do, officer, because last time I stopped it, last time I blocked him, he was at my door and he strangled me, or he used to strangle me when we were together. But this works. I don't want to speak to him, but I have to speak to him because it keeps me safe. Now, we wouldn't say proactively to somebody, contact your stalker. So when I say inconsistent, but helping victims articulate this and understand risk from that objective perspective, um, they have to be very boundaried and also manage their expectations. But one thing that we find in terms of those working with moving forward type strategies is that after they get that support, that validation, and being reassured, we might not know why your stalker, or this is why we think this is why your stalker's doing it, and this is how you can become an active participant in your own safeguarding. You're not, because they often feel powerless, but when they feel empowered to become an evidence gathering, not that we're saying they should investigate, but actually you are doing something practically to keep yourself safe, and we can work with that and help you. We see from a crime recording perspective, they become like their own little crime hotspot, because every noise they hear, the security light comes on outside, they'll report it, even if they've not seen their stalker. So we see this, they've reported, and then reoffending appears to go. But you speak to the victim and they say, but I feel safer because I know it's been taken seriously. I know it's important to log this stuff. I know it shows that pattern a bit. It seems perverse and inconsistent, but a lot of the work that our advocates do with victims is around helping them to live with stalking. How do I live? How do I cope knowing that somebody might be preoccupied with me or is intent on doing harm? And that is, like I said previously, that is no easy task. But they absolutely do their best. And there are victims who I know are eternally grateful for, having this voice of reason, if you like, come in and help them make sense of a very uncertain situation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about it. How do you live, or how do you function with this problem while it's still continuing? Because otherwise, the other approach is that it has to stop, and of course, then your well-being hinges on it, and you essentially, you lose your,
Yeah,
your
right.
ability
And
to have any control.
yeah, I use this analogy I know Tracy Morgan, who I mentioned previously. This is another analogy that she would give as well. That if we're sat here and I have the thought as to whether I might be burgled hasn't even entered my head until I'm saying this now. And for most people, I'll say, you've left your house, you've locked your doors, you might have set your burglar alarm, whatever. Why have you done that? Well, to keep myself safe, to stop protect my property, etc. But you've not given it a second thought today. But imagine sitting here knowing that somebody's trying to get into your house. Do you think you'd be able to concentrate? Do you think it'd affect your performance at work? Do you think your adrenaline starts to constantly pump you, knowing that you are the target of somebody's obsession, fixation, or preoccupation? It's how do you live with that? How do you cope? How do you, because they feel powerless. They feel like a sitting duck waiting for something to happen. So, yeah, there are various strategies that are employed, like, even simple things, like I said, like with the contact, where, we advise victims curb all contact to an absolute minimum. But it would be wrong for us to say as a blanket, block them, cut them off. Because if that's the only thing keeping you safe from the risk of physical attack, we don't want to put you at more risk. But we can, well, let's use this as your evidence gathering phone. And here's another one. This is your safe phone. So your evidence gathering phone is not sit there and put up with abuse, but actually this is helping us in a relatively safer way gather evidence to do our job, to hold this person to account, and framing it and thinking about it like that. And just as a point of reference, the most common stalking behaviours are unsolicited phone calls, text messages, and social media posts. The safeguarding objective in all this is to keep as much physical distance between the stalker and the victim, because we don't. If they're close together, they're in an increased risk of a physical attack. But if we cut off the only relatively safe evidence gathering method available to us, the next most common behaviour is spying. So we're potentially decreasing this proximity thing. And, if they are an obsessed stalker, if the phone gets cut off or they change the number, they're not just going to, that's it now, I'll move on. They're obsessed. They can't. They have to. That desire for contact and closeness in many cases is, and we potentially, it's it's one of the few crimes that we get involved with, certainly from a policing perspective, where even with the best of intentions, we actually make it worse. Thinking we're doing the right thing by telling victims to block and cut off and come off social media. If we mess it up at the start, we potentially accelerate that trajectory I was talking about. A shoplifting, theft of a pack of sausages. I'm not saying that retail crime isn't important, but even if we mess up that investigation, we're probably not going to make it much catastrophically worse for the people involved. But with stalking, the stakes are always high. That risk is always there, however remote. There's always, so all the more reason to deal with it as robustly as early as possible to stop that. That it's like we put it on a roller coaster almost towards this catastrophic outcome. Yeah.
Gosh, I think you summed that up, incredibly well. Just how we need to be so careful and make sure we really do approach it on a case by case basis. There's no universal rules, is there, that we can apply it? You've got to take it each person and each situation. What about
Absolutely.
with perpetrators? Have there been strategies, approaches, prevention methods that your unit has found to be effective with them?
Yeah, it's very much that combination, the psychology, the social, and the legal all happening together. And this is a really important point, that our model isn't one of, it's either disrupt, i.e. catch and convict and put them in prison, or divert into therapeutic type, it's not an either or, it's an and. So a combination of the legal and the psychological, not just in terms of, the therapeutic type intervention is a small but significant part of that broader approach that I've tried to describe. And yeah, it very much is dependent on the individual and understanding them. We do get stalkers who have substantial chronic sort of mental disorders, in that very sort of delusional disorders, where yes, medication and other therapeutic interventions can be helpful. They tend to attenuate the intensity of the beliefs and the behaviours, but not always a permanent fix, as long as they're taking medication and that that it's maintained that within the community if they're not an inpatient, but also from other conditions, whether that's learning difficulties, learning disabilities, people who might have neuro or developmental conditions, autism, are going to respond very differently to people that might not have those conditions. And it is very much understanding about that person. So that needs responsivity type model. What's going to work for this individual? And it might be a lot of what is done is that sort of psycho education type work. What we've noticed seems to be more effective with most stalkers is addressing that personal cost. So certainly with rejected stalkers, it's very much about me, me, me. Compared to an intimacy seeking stalker who's obsessed with a celebrity or thinks they're married to some or whatever it is, it's all about them. Whereas rejected stalkers, they're sort of protecting themselves from that rejection and that injury that they experience. That the stalking almost soothes that insult that they feel they're experiencing. So when we're tapping into that personal cost stuff, that almost that narcissistic quality is more effective than putting them in a group on a domestic abuse course geared at seeing things from a victim's perspective and empathizing with victims. Well, guess what? Stalkers know what makes their victims scared. That's why they're flipping doing it. You know what I mean? We don't want to give them tips, and certainly people with, this is recognized like in the stalking risk profile, people with, I'm not saying diagnosed psychopaths, which is rare in stalking, but certainly people with psychopathic traits, the last thing we want to do is put them in a group of other like-minded or other abusive people. It'd probably be certainly counterproductive. So, yeah, the therapeutic goal of a lot of the more conventional schemes and interventions out there is often about, well, do you know how scared of it? How would you feel? Well, they know. They know. That's why they're creating a website about them. That's why they're trying to destroy their reputation. They know the impact it's having. So let's move away from, but tapping into that personal cost. What can we do to help you stop being arrested? What do you need to do? And we've had, there's so many different examples, and they are quite unique. I remember Dan, the psychologist in our team, telling me about a chap that they went to see in prison, convicted of stalking an ex-partner. And we do an exercise with officers when we train them. We say, well, what is stalking? And they come up with all these words that are associated with it. It's sometimes a hard thing to pin down. And we do a similar exercise with this individual, and it's repeated, it's this, and, like, I'm not a stalker. Stalking's like people in bushes, loitering and waiting to pounce on it. And he goes through this exercise of coming up with words, and then he comes to this, I think Dan said to him, well, do they want it to happen then? They're like, no, it's unwanted. And Dan said you could almost hear the penny hit the floor. And I know it seemed, people will listen to this and think, oh, stalkers are manipulative and all that. But this particular individual, he went, yeah, it's unwanted, isn't it? And you could see this, his mind, he knows it's unwanted, but to articulate it, and you're starting to open up that protective shield of, because if at that point with rejected stalkers, certainly, where you're exposing them to, I'll say it. So what we have noticed with a lot of these type of stalkers is that they are very, very inadequate, socially, emotionally, immature, inadequate individuals. And when they are exposed to that reality of that inadequacy, that you are being rejected, you aren't good enough, all this stuff that's probably eating away at them, that the stalking protects them from, it is a really risky time when you start to when somebody becomes aware of that reality. It has to be done in a very safe way, as you can appreciate. But for this individual, it was the right approach at the right time, and they were able to deal with that. Just that, what to us and him, we know it's unwanted, but for him to articulate it himself through a very simple exercise. I'm not saying that works for everybody, and it does highlight the need for that sort of bespoke intervention, but that's just one example. But yeah, strategies will vary from individual to individual depending on exactly their needs, their cognitive ability. If you're trying to deal with complex emotional interpersonal relationship topics with somebody who, because of a developmental condition, might not be able to process that information in the same way. So somebody with autism might not be able to deal with those abstract concepts in the same way. Ironically, people with autism, so some of our what are termed incompetent suitor or incompetent stalkers, tend to be the most responsive people to therapeutic type interventions, often rigidly law-abiding individuals, because the law says this, and if you don't do that, then if you do this, you'll go to prison. So often we tell them to stop, and they stop. A police officer in uniform visiting every month, just checking in, is reinforcing that if you do this, you will be. And I know it's not as straightforward in many cases, but actually, in terms of what might be missing in their lives, it is relatively easier to plug in those sorts of cases than somebody like a domestic abuse stalker who doesn't have mental health conditions in that sense, who might not have developmental conditions, who has a home, who has money, who has a job, but hates women. There's no pill, there's no quick course that we're going to put somebody on to convince them otherwise. But yeah.
David, look, I could talk to you for another couple of hours. I think there's so much to talk about, isn't there, when you start to unpack these folks, and as well, of course, the police response. How we look at it from a threat perspective. There's also an enormous amount around that we could really delve into. We might have to do a part two at some stage. But look,
there is a lot, isn't there?
Yeah. Look, I really appreciate your time today, though. I mean, it's quite phenomenal, the response that you've got going on over there with the harm reduction unit. I'm reasonably well across various threat teams, internationally, and what they do, and the approach that your team has adopted is very unique. I haven't come across anything like that uniquely to stalking before. It's lumped in with other forms of offending or other sort of threat teams, where stalking is just one aspect of it. But it's a fantastic model that you've developed.
Thank you. No, it's we're conscious. It shouldn't be the exception. It's for the scale of it, the prevalence of this. It's not a niche thing that hardly happens to anyone. It is a highly prevalent form of, psychologically at least, violent crime, and hopefully things will change. The super complaint that some listeners might have heard of in this country really put the police and the government and other agencies, but primarily the police, on notice that the status quo isn't good enough, and things are starting to change. Not quick enough for my liking, but hopefully we'll see more of this.
Yeah, I mean, stalking, it sits in the shadows, but what you've done really brings it to the forefront, and at the forefront of policing as well. And it has unfortunately sat often at the back of police responses. So yeah, it's wonderful to hear what you're doing, and also the results that you're having as well. So once again, I really appreciate your time today and coming on to the podcast. I hope that we can continue to educate people around the seriousness of stalking, and also, of course, what can be done to intervene and prevent it early on before it becomes either more persistent or more serious.
Thanks for having me, and maybe we'll speak again.
Wonderful. Thank you, David.
Thank you for listening to the Targeted Violence podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please support the show by subscribing. Stay tuned for more episodes.